All right, welcome. So this is basically a plein air painting done in the studio. And so I've taken these photos over several years and over several times. And one of the big things is that when I do this, I'm in Algoma, which is the city that I'm painting, and I'm always painting this same kind of location. I paint it multiple times just for the simple fact that, honestly, the painting sells. And I think it sells because where all these other boats are white, there's this nice big and bright orange boat sitting out there. And so this is done in the studio versus in outside. Now outside, when I'm plein air painting, outside is generally on average 2 hours of painting time, and honestly 2 to 3 hours. The sun changes. I'm also working smaller. I'm usually working anything smaller from 8 by 10 to 11 by 14, and I'm really focused on getting everything down and getting a good composition. Whereas in the studio, this piece is 24 by 36. No, sorry, 18 by 24. And it is a much brighter, much faster process because I'm pretty much working from a photograph. Now, when I did this, I treated this much like I do a plein air painting. I pretty much started from the background to the foreground. I used drying agents, so I used like a 511, and I used basically lighter colors, less desaturated elements. And that, as I move forward or closer, I'm using more and more darker and more saturated values. And so when I'm painting this, the big thing is that as I paint this, the purpose of this is basically to do the same thing in plein air. Now, what I'm painting is pretty much a couple of boats, and in the background, mid-ground actually, there's a whole slew of junk. It's boats, it's cars, it's things like that. And so like in plein air painting, you have to remove some of these elements to make a better composition. You know, you don't always want all that noise and all that junk sitting there. And so these are all things that you have to consider when you're painting a plein air versus when you're painting studio painting. I can always, with a studio painting, say, oh, you know what, I don't like this. I need to wipe and or paint over it or do this. In plein air, the choices are a lot more limited versus in the studio. And so one of the things that you see here at this point, I've already painted most of my base colors, most of my base values, and all that's in. And in plein air painting, one of the big things I would be doing is if I need more detail or I want more kind of reference to that lighting of when I'm painting, I might go back a second day. And the aspect of studio painting, I can sit on things a day or two and kind of work from there. Now, plein air painting has taught me a lot about painting in general. One of the big things that I've always kind of come up against is that I'm painting, when I'm doing plein air, I have to think about the problems and I have to solve them right away. And that's something that you don't have to do in the studio. In the studio, you are kind of sitting there and you can kind of hem and haw over it and you can paint over it and do things like that. Whereas in plein air, most of the times what I'm doing is I'm simply trying to get everything solved before the light comes in. And there's a lot of different types of plein air artists. I paint with some very different people who have way different styles and different purposes when they go out and paint. I have some who want to just get a rough in when they're painting and then they go back to the studio and finish it up. I have others who they paint for 2 to 3 hours and they are done. They never put in much more time and they really don't ever go back to the studio, and if they do, it's just a couple brush strokes here and there just to accent it. And so that's a big aspect of plein air painting. Weather and wind elements makes a lot of different choices for you as well. Oftentimes, I admit it, I'm a wimp. I don't want to sit out in the rain anymore, or sit out in the wind, or sit out in the cold weather. It's just not something I want to do. And so for something like this, I mean, this was done in, I think I did it in February and March, which are one of the coldest areas in Wisconsin. So I don't want to sit out there and freeze my butt off. And on top of that, there's no snow this year. This year it was really bad. And so I just can't find a good location. And then you got these gray like skies, and it's just not very entertaining. So that's why I did a studio painting instead. And working in the studio, one of the big things about working in the studio is I have the ability to let things just dry. Working bigger, so I can always work in different areas and things like that. When you're doing plein air painting, you generally want to use some type of a drier medium when you're using with oils. So in this case, I'm using what they call a 5-1-1, and the 5-1-1 is 5 parts mineral spirits and 1 part stand oil and 1 part Damvar varnish. And you mix it together, and it creates this kind of just liquidy liquidy substance, and you paint with it. And the nice thing about it is if you paint thin, it dries a lot faster. Within 20 minutes, things start tacking up. And so that was one of the biggest struggles that I ran into with any amount of plein air painting. I was horrible with it. Honestly, when you start out, you have to figure these things out for yourself. And there's others that use different mediums as well. There's a ton of them out there, and it's basically just what you find you like or don't like. Now, the nice thing about having a drying agent when you're doing plein air painting is basically a process of being able to go over things and paint. Whereas if you're painting on wet paint, that wet paint can taint other areas and basically turn into mud or things like that. And so with this, you can see that I'm very simply kind of going over and painting things. Now, you'll notice on here I have wrinkles in the bottom. I'm using an actual canvas. And to be honest with you, the canvas, I didn't realize it was bad until I started painting on it, was the simple fact that the wood had bowed. I fixed it later by just putting a piece of wood in there to force it away from the bow, and that kind of tightened everything up. I also sprayed some water on the back, and then eventually I put in some gesso on the back. And what that allowed me to do was to basically create a more viable, surface, a tighter surface. And the other thing is that I'm a brush painter. I don't use a lot of palette knives. I've seen artists use a ton of palette knives. In fact, I know one artist who that's all they use is a palette knife. I always feel that that's too thick, and I'm kind of stingy when it comes to paint. I'd rather mix a little bit of paint and run out of it and have to remix it than to mix a big glob of paint and never use it. And so you can see here, now it's starting to take hold and things are starting to shape it up. And this is exactly what I'm doing in plein air too. At this point, I would be simply working on details and getting those little bitty pieces in there. And that's one of the big things that when you're doing plein air, you have to work fast in order to get to those simple details. And you also notice that when I'm painting, when you paint architecture or buildings or cars or things like that, you have a lot of straight lines. And so I generally don't use a maul stick. I know a lot of artists who do, and they use them, and I've just never been able to kind of get used to the idea of a maul stick. So I tend to use other things. I do have a little maul stick that's about 12 inches long that I can put on my painting and kind of paint over it. But when you're working so small, your hand and the brush, you can use a pinky to trace straight and horizontal and vertical lines. Whereas on a bigger painting like this, a lot of the stuff I do is so just meticulously done, and I'm working in the studio, that I don't worry too much about straight lines. As long as they don't have that, an obvious wave in the line, I'm pretty good with it. And those are things that, I need to work on as I paint more and more. And at this point, you can also see that most of my subject is done. And all I'm doing is the little detail work. I'm, at this point, adding in just little, antennas and railings and the little detail stuff. And honestly, in most of my paintings that I do, that's the majority of the work that I do. By the time I block it in and get the roughs in there and get the rough colors in there, I pretty much have 50% of the painting done, maybe even 75. And then what happens is the rest is just all the little things that you want to put in. It's the ropes, it's the little details, and those are the things that take the longest. And so when I'm working on that type of thing, it's just a matter of me going through and kind of detailing each process. And one of the things that I have to force myself to do, I got a lot of OCD here, so one of the things that I have to force myself to do is honestly simply pull back sometimes. Like when I'm painting the boats here, I don't have to worry about, I can paint antennas, I can paint the ropes, I can paint all of that stuff. But anything further back, I really want, especially with a photo where you can zoom up in it and kind of work with that from a different standpoint, you want to simplify things in the background. So that's my process. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And I hope you enjoyed the process of this, and you can see the artwork on my website or even purchase it. Thanks much.